Do you like that I dressed up as a nurse for this one? Well, technically I'm dressed as a dental hygienist, but if you couldn't tell, don't worry, this guy couldn't either.
Looks good on you.
Oh.
You wear it well.
Thank you. Why are histories told? The assumption I usually default to is that historians are trying to gain some insight into how a system works and why it was built to work the way it does, as a way of gaining some insight into the modern day. After all, they live here in the modern day, and anybody who's going to read their work is a contemporary of theirs. Capitalism? Gotta figure it out. Global warming? Let's check the history for what went wrong. Distribution, urbanization, preservation, all things that can be examined critically through the discipline of history. But not all accounts of the past are capital H histories written by academic historians. Memoirs, for example, like Jennifer Worth's Call the Midwife, draw on personal memory as their primary source. Of course, memoirs often do involve lots of research, especially if the subject that they're covering either happened decades ago or if memories are a little bit fuzzy. But the important thing to remember is that even though there's research, this is a conversation between two contemporaries, a story that's told based in memories because they think that other people living in the world today can benefit from having heard their experiences, their stories, and their takeaways. The BBC show Call the Midwife has been on air for 10 years and has an average viewership of 10 million. The show's been incredibly impactful in sharing the stories of life and public health from the point of view of medical professionals in London slums in the late 50s and the 1960s. A main cast of nurses and nuns makes up the almost all-female ensemble. The stories shed light on everything from the history of polio to birth control to thalidomide. The stories cover happenings from 55 years ago, each season moves forward 1 year, and give some very insightful history on the problems which our modern systems, like the NHS, are put in place to solve. Some of the stories have happy endings, and other ones sad, and you never quite know what you're going to get. But again and again, the show proves itself capable of tackling complex social issues in ways that are both heart-wrenching and thought-provoking. And then, in Season 4, Episode 3, we're treated to the story of a couple whose lives are turned upside down by the gross indecency of the husband who was caught cheating with another man. The episode has received a lot of praise, and rightly so, I think, for the way that it depicts the struggles of being a gay person in the 1950s, including the policing of the semi-public spaces like public bathrooms where they would find each other. If caught, one might face 2 years in prison or a medical conversion therapy like electroshock or chemical castration. All of this in addition to the kind of public shaming that came with being any kind of deviant during the Cold War. In the narrative, the horror of it all, including the body horror of having to take feminizing hormones, gets to be too much, and Tony attempts suicide. It's a very sad episode about being trapped by others' expectations of you, and if you fail to conform to those expectations, they're hunting you down for it. Or, it should be a sad episode. While the content of this episode communicates an important history to the modern audience, the framing of this episode fails to live up to the standards set by this television show, which has already proved itself to be able to handle complex topics of public health, human sexuality, and the legal system. This essay argues that in this episode, the framing devices used by the writers fail to communicate to the audience how they're supposed to feel about the content of the history that they're seeing in this episode. We conclude with some recommendations for how to fix the narrative. Part 1. Who is the system? If there's an antagonist in this episode, it is, nebulously, the system. The judge who convicts Tony, of course, but in typical fashion for this show, Sergeant Noakes plays a role too. It's this series' regular, in fact, who sets the trap. In response to complaints about gay men cruising in the semi-private of public bathrooms, Sergeant Noakes places undercover cops in the bathrooms to catch and arrest the gays. But how are we, then in 2015 and now in 2021, supposed to reconcile this with Sergeant Noakes, whom the writers have told us for 3 years at this point is a good person and is someone to root for? Because what he did was pretty horrible by any reasonable standard held by a 2015 audience member. It's certainly not the kind of thing they could approve of. So here's where the cinematic framing comes in. The writers skirt the issue. Our modern audience are not given the cinematic cues you would expect to accompany egregious on-screen behavior. Even though Sergeant Noakes takes an active role in setting the honeypot trap, he's framed as a man just doing his job, and the narrative is quick to move on to the next thing. This way, they don't have to worry about either justifying Sergeant Noakes' behavior or complicating the morality of a main character. Is the law bad? Well, certainly. The script is nothing but sympathetic to the victims of these laws. But is Sergeant Noakes bad? Well, that's a slippery slope, and after all, you need your main characters to be likable. Surely, though, in a television show so devoted to exploring topics of human sexuality and public health, they could have devoted a little bit more care and scrutiny to this paradigm. Having a main character take such an active role in enforcing these laws could be a really insightful window in seeing how the laws shape social attitudes and how those social attitudes shape how the laws are carried out. This show's already proven that it can tackle difficult issues, so for it to fall down in this episode actually feels out of place. Part 2, the Rats of Society. Another issue of framing comes in the narrative comparison between gay men and rats. At several points in the episode, characters try and take care of a rat infestation. In the last of these scenes, Sister Monica Joan tries to stop 3 boys who had cornered and are trying to kill a rat. She says, "Boys, what are you doing? What would your parents say?" To which they respond, "They hate rats too." One of the midwives takes her aside and says, "I do wish you would stop with these blasted rats." And she says, "We are all God's creatures." To which the other midwife says, "It's just that some of them are easier to love than others." And the sister says, "It's the others that need us the most." The point of this motif is that everyone needs an advocate, and those who are shunned by societies need advocates the most. However, because of the circumstances in which it was said and the imperfect nature of the foil, it doesn't sit right. The first big problem is that the writers are comparing a group of marginalized people to rats. This is so egregious that it's actually against the YouTube terms of service to compare marginalized groups to animals. People don't like rats because they're vermin, because they infest your house, because they eat your food, because they leave their droppings, because they chew through walls. Rats aren't people. They serve no social function. They do not have a place in society, and it is not a hate crime to kill a rat. And maybe you're thinking, sure, but in the 1950s, people did think of gay people much the same as they thought of rats. And true, but remember, it's not the characters who are making this comparison. It's the modern day writers speaking to their modern day audience. It's the modern day writers who are implementing foils and motifs as a way of navigating a conversation around a complex social issue. Beyond this most basic comparison, it's also worth taking a closer look at how the characters interact in this scene and who the audience are supposed to side with. When the 2 nurses take Sister Monica Joan aside, the audience sides with them. Please take this lady away from the rats before they bite her. But is that how we're supposed to think of and treat advocates for gay rights? Please take them away from the gay men before something bad happens. They're so gross. That's what the foil would have you believe. Now, is that what I think the show's actually going for? No. Considering that the show has multiple lesbian characters, I don't think that these politics are being mindfully pushed here. A really homophobic show wouldn't have brought these issues up at all, and I get that. However, it's still important to notice and understand the messages in our media, even and especially when they reveal internal conflict. Part 3, the ending. Finally, the ending of the episode is quite revealing. Even as Tony faces the body horror of taking feminizing hormones, losing muscle mass, becoming sterile, growing breast tissue, and attempts suicide in the face of a life he doesn't feel is worth living, the narrator chimes in with platitudes. But that place which we call home must be the place where we are ourselves, with no facade, no foundations weak below us. Only then can we face outward with our heads held high, playing the roles assigned to us with open, honest hearts. It all makes you feel like everything's going to be okay, like everything's been tied up with a neat little bow. when this couldn't be further from the truth. This isn't a happy ending. This is a waking nightmare. Tony still has a criminal record as a sex pervert. His body's about to be wrecked by a hormone regimen prescribed to him by the courts as punishment for being gay. He's in a loveless marriage to a woman who wants him to be someone he isn't. Without that foundation beneath him, as our narrator so concisely puts it, he will never be able to fully be himself. Part 4. Ideas for rewriting. With all of that in mind, here are a few ideas I have for tweaking and rewriting the episode. To be clear, this episode was so close to being great. These are really just a couple of small changes that would help align the way the audience feels with what they're seeing on the screen. The first thing to do is to get rid of the rat motif. It doesn't work as a storytelling device, and it's pretty bad to compare LGBT people to vermin. I would then put some of that newly found extra time towards exploring in more depth the relationship between Sergeant Noakes and the law that he has to carry out. Let's do a character study of a good person who has to be the arm of a law that hurts lots of people. We can also take the opportunity to look at some of the sociological causes that force gay men to find each other in this way. It's not like they did it because they wanted to be a criminal or because they felt like getting away with something. They were being human, like everyone else on this show. And then at the end, instead of platitudes, what about hitting us with what happens next, or giving us the kind of reflections you'd expect from someone who's had 55 years to think about this? The narrator of this show and the framing device is that an old woman in 2015 is telling her life story. She's seen so much, and the world has changed around her. Surely she would have an interesting thing or two to say about this. It could have been a really powerful ending, and instead we got platitudes that aren't even applicable to the situation. Obviously, I can't rewrite an episode of television, but there's still something we can glean from this exercise. If we're careful about the messages that we put out into the world, we can make sure that the story we're telling aligns with the kind of story it is. Is this a happy story we're telling, or a sad one? Do we want to encourage allies and advocates, or discourage them? And how do we feel about the people who enforce unjust laws? When the answers to a story's central questions are all in alignment, the story itself becomes much more powerful.